In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. I preached a different sermon at the early service, but in between I realized there was something else I wanted to say about this gospel text. Some of you know that my father, a priest for 68 years, died about 6 weeks ago, and a story came to my mind that had to do with him in relation to today's gospel, and I wanted to offer it. I'm the second of 6 children in this family, and among the 6, I was probably the most persistent. Speaking of the widow in our text today, I can think of many times when I came to my father and pleaded for justice. Sometimes getting it, sometimes not. But years later, when I was a young adult in my 30s, I was an early music professional in Boston. I did that for 9 years before I was ordained. An early music professional means that I was living a world focusing on music of the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the Baroque era. I was a choral conductor, and am probably the only person you'll ever meet who has a master's degree in the recorder. I was a professional recorder player in Boston, but I also played wild and weird contemporary music. Some of the kids at the school up here have heard me do some of that. At any rate, I was an up-and-coming player. I was teaching at a conservatory. It was heady days. I was playing in really great places. But I also began to realize that the world of 8x10 glossies was just not me. I didn't want to sell myself on the market. And I had also recently come to faith again, having done the preacher's kid thing and really completely left the fold for a good 10 years. And when in a moment of real prayer and thoughtfulness and connection with the monks of the Society of St. John the Evangelist, some of you may have heard of them in Boston. They do a lot of email ministry. I began to think that God was calling me to do something else with my life. So I went through all the processes. I met with the Bishop of New Hampshire, where we lived, Philip Smith, and he said, yeah, you can talk to the Commission on Ministry. So I went to meet with this group to talk about how I thought I'd heard God in prayer, and I really needed to do something with my life. And they said, well, tell us about your music. I get really excited when I talk about that music. I still do. So don't get me started on that part. I will say enough to know that I'm still so into the recorder that Mary and I just ordered a matched consort, 12 instruments of recorders, the biggest being this tall. You've never seen one that big, I bet. At any rate, we're still doing that. But I went in and they said, well, tell us about your music. And I said, oh, I just love it. You know, I do basically 16th century jazz. We improvise on popular tunes of the 16th century, you know. And we do all this. And I've got this great concert. I'm playing in Carnegie Hall in a couple of weeks, and I can't wait. Got home that afternoon after talking to them and talking about my call and all that. And I get the call, and they said, actually, we don't think you're really ready to leave music. Why don't you come back next year? Now, I was of a mind in those days to think that I could do anything I wanted to do. That when I felt like I wanted to go in a certain direction, I could say, well, that's where I'm going to go, and it became, you know, okay, yeah, great, we want you. They said come back next year. What I heard was no. Now, I was new enough in my return to faith and had been getting so many yeses, not about ordained ministry per se, but about just life. I suddenly was feeling loved by God. And yet here was my church saying what I heard as no. When somebody really tells you, if that's what you hear from somebody, it can do funny things to you. I began to think, well, what am I going to do with my life? I know that I'm ready to leave music, but what am I going to do with my life? I went into such a dark time that I had 6 months of pure despair. And probably 8 months after that meeting, when they said that, I still didn't know what I was going to do. I called this father of mine who had really been one of those ones who, together with my mother, who loved us into being. And he says, well, Andrew, I can't answer the question for you. But go read the last verse of Isaiah 40. Those who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. And all of the pleading I had been directing at God in prayer suddenly found an answer of sorts, which was, just be silent. Just listen. The unjust judge in our parable was corrupt. The woman who pleaded with him was a widow, and widows were almost by definition in poverty. And what he wanted from her was a bribe to get justice. It was only by her persistence that she got justice. You know, sometimes that parable is known as the parable of the importunate woman, also known as the pushy woman. But Jesus blesses her in this story. He also says, pray persistently that you may come into faith. I felt as if all that prayer had been heard in a way such that when I finally, a year later, went back before that commission, it was no longer important. It was important, but it wasn't. I was willing to be told a real no, if that was what the answer was going to be. And yet it was that waiting. I couldn't have waited if I hadn't pushed. So when I think about all of our lives in God, in prayer, we have to know what's at stake for us in this world. We have to know what matters to us so that when we go to God in prayer, we can beg for it and trust that an answer will come. It may or may not be the answer we want, the answer that we want to demand, but persistence means we care. Jesus is saying two things. By saying persist, he's also saying my life with you matters. Be with me, I will be with you. And the gift my Father gave me that day, a gift I have treasured for decades now, was simply to listen and to wait. God will bring us what we need.